The laughter cut through the Arizona heat like a blade. It started from one man, then spread across the training yard of Fort Sentinel like wildfire catching dry brush. 23 people stood scattered across the dusty compound, and not a single one of them stepped forward to stop what was happening. Lieutenant Commander Blake Thornton stood at the center of it all, his SEAL trident gleaming against his chest like a trophy he'd won and never stopped polishing. 6'2", shoulders built for combat, jaw cut from the same granite as the mountains surrounding the base. He held a tactical training collar in his right hand, the leather still warm from the 105-degree sun beating down on the K9 facility. And then he threw it. The collar landed at the feet of a woman pushing a supply cart across the yard. Small, maybe 5'4" on a generous day. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail that had seen better mornings, and her civilian contractor badge read a single name: Willow. "Hey, supply girl!" She stopped, didn't look up. "I'm talking to you." Blake's voice carried the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. "The equipment you've been handing out is garbage. Pure garbage. These dogs won't follow commands, and it's because of the junk collars and harnesses you keep shoving at us." Behind him, 15 Belgian Malinois stood in formation. The finest military working dogs in the border program, each one worth more than most soldiers' annual salaries. Their handlers, a mix of Navy personnel and support staff, watched the confrontation with varying degrees of interest. The woman called Willow bent down slowly. Her fingers wrapped around the collar, and for just a moment her thumb traced the leather stitching with a precision that seemed almost automatic, like muscle memory buried so deep it couldn't be suppressed. But no one noticed. "Well?" Blake crossed his arms. "You got anything to say for yourself?" Silence. Petty Officer First Class Amber Sutton stepped forward, her blonde hair pulled into a regulation bun that somehow still managed to look like she'd spent an hour on it. She was the only female handler in the SEAL contingent, and she'd clawed her way to that position with a combination of skill and a tongue sharp enough to cut glass. "She can't even make eye contact," Amber said, her lip curling. "Probably never seen a real military working dog outside of a YouTube video. What did they hire her for anyway? Scooping kibble?" A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Willow placed the collar carefully on her cart. Her hands moved to straighten the other equipment, arranging the leashes into neat coils with movements that were just a little too quick, a little too precise for someone who supposedly just handed out supplies. 50 feet away, something changed. Rex, the lead dog of the pack, lifted his head. His ears rotated forward like satellite dishes, locking onto a signal. The massive Belgian Malinois, all 90 pounds of muscle and training, had been sitting perfectly still for the past 20 minutes. Now his entire body tensed, nose pointing directly at the woman by the cart. Chief Petty Officer Derek Walsh caught the movement. "Thornton, Rex is doing something weird." Blake barely glanced over. "Probably smells the dog food on her clothes. Ignore it." But Rex wasn't reacting to food. The dog's muscles had gone rigid beneath his tan coat, trembling with an energy that had nothing to do with hunger. It was a response that only experienced canine handlers would recognize, one that took years of bonding to develop. The response of a military working dog recognizing someone from its past. In the next 20 minutes, everything at Fort Sentinel was about to change, and these 15 dogs were going to show everyone on this base exactly who their real alpha was. The heat pressed down on the compound like a physical weight as Willow pushed her cart toward the equipment shed. The wheels squeaked against the packed dirt, a small sound that seemed impossibly loud in the tension-thick air. She'd made it maybe 30 feet when a shadow fell across her path. Amber Sutton planted herself directly in front of the cart, arms crossed, chin lifted at an angle that suggested she'd practiced this pose in front of a mirror. "Excuse me, civilian. This section of the yard is restricted during active training exercises." Willow stopped. Her eyes stayed fixed on a point somewhere around Amber's collarbone, never rising to meet the other woman's gaze. "I need to deliver these supplies to the storage unit," she said quietly. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic. The handlers requested additional bite sleeves for the afternoon session. Did I stutter? Amber took a step closer. Restricted. That means you walk around, take the long way. We don't need civilians wandering through our training space and distracting the animals. A reasonable person might have pointed out that the storage unit was directly behind Amber, that walking around would add an extra 10 minutes to the trip, that the equipment was needed in less than 15. Willow said none of these things. Instead, she began to turn her cart around. As she did, her gaze swept across the line of dogs with a speed that should have been impossible to track anything, but her lips moved, just slightly, as if counting. 15. All accounted for. Rex, Shadow, Ghost, Titan, and 11 others whose names she somehow seemed to know even though no one had told her. "Move faster," Amber called after her. "Some of us have actual work to do." Gunnery Sergeant Silas Porter watched the exchange from his position near the water station. He'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 of them working alongside military dogs, and something about the supply woman nagged at him. The way she'd handled that collar earlier, the way she'd scanned the dogs just now. That wasn't civilian behavior. He filed the observation away and said nothing. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We post military stories every single day, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next in this one. The moment these 15 dogs recognize their true handler will give you chills. Drop a comment below telling us your favorite military dog story. Now, let's get back to Fort Sentinel. The afternoon sun had shifted by the time Willow made it back to the main training area. She'd taken the long route as ordered, and her cart now carried a fresh load of equipment that had been requested by the K-9 coordinators. Derek Walsh intercepted her before she could reach the drop-off point. "Hold up." He grabbed one of the tactical harnesses from her cart, turning it over in his hands with the exaggerated care of someone looking for any excuse to find fault. Walsh was a chief petty officer with 12 years of service and a reputation for being the smartest person in any room, at least according to himself. "This is the wrong size. Size 4? These dogs need size 5 harnesses minimum." Willow's hands stayed at her sides. Size 4 is standard for Belgian Malinois within breed specifications. Size 5 would cause chafing during extended operations. Walsh's head snapped up. "Excuse me? I'm sorry." The words came automatically, a reflex. "I just meant that the requisition form specified size 4 based on the dog's measurements." "Oh, so now the supply girl is teaching me about K-9 equipment." Walsh tossed the harness onto the ground. "I've been working with military dogs for 8 years. You've been here, what, 2 weeks? Handing out kibble and picking up the occasional piece of paper?" He kicked the harness toward her feet. "Pick it up. And next time, maybe stick to what you know, which, from what I can tell, isn't much." Willow bent to retrieve the harness. Her fingers closed around the fabric with that same unconscious precision from before, left hand finding the adjustment strap, while her right automatically checked the quick release buckle. A sequence that should have taken a novice 30 seconds to figure out, completed in less than 3. Silas Porter saw it. His eyes narrowed. But before he could process what he'd witnessed, a new voice cut across the yard. "Civilian contractors are required to display their identification badges at all times while on base." Master-at-Arms Carter Mills approached with the measured stride of a man who enforced rules for a living and enjoyed every second of it. His security uniform was pressed to perfection, his expression carved from ice. "Your badge is facing the wrong direction." Willow looked down at her chest. The badge had indeed flipped during her work. She reached up to adjust it, her movements quick and efficient. "My apologies, sir. It must have turned while I was moving equipment." Mills studied her for a long moment. There was something about this woman that didn't add up, but he couldn't quite identify what. Her posture was too still, her composure too controlled. Civilians usually got flustered when security personnel approached them. This one barely blinked. "See that it doesn't happen again," he said finally. "I'll be watching." He walked away, but not before casting one more suspicious glance over his shoulder. The afternoon training session began at 1400 hours. Lieutenant Commander Thornton had arranged his team in a semicircle around the main demonstration area, with the 15 dogs positioned at various stations. The objective was simple: standard obedience drills to establish baseline compliance before moving on to more advanced exercises. It should have been routine. Rex was the first problem. "Higher!" Blake commanded, using the German word for come that was standard in military canine training. "Rex, higher!" The Belgian Malinois didn't move. His eyes were fixed on a point across the yard, where Willow had resumed organizing supplies near the equipment shed. His tail twitched once, twice, and his ears rotated toward her like compass needles finding north. "Rex!" Blake's voice sharpened. "Higher! Now!" The dog took one step forward, then stopped, then turned his head back toward the woman. Blake's jaw tightened. "What is wrong with this animal?" "Maybe he's distracted, sir." One of the junior handlers offered the suggestion hesitantly. "There's a lot of activity on the yard today. A military working dog worth $500,000 doesn't get distracted by activity." Blake strode toward Rex, frustration radiating from every step. "This is sabotage. Someone has been interfering with these dogs." His gaze landed on Willow. "You." He pointed directly at her. "Get over here." She approached slowly, cart abandoned, hands clasped in front of her in a posture of submission that seemed almost rehearsed. "The dogs have been acting strange ever since you started working here," Blake said. "What have you been doing to them? Feeding them unauthorized treats? Using some kind of scent that's messing with their training?" "I haven't done anything, sir. I just distribute equipment." "Then explain why Rex, a dog who has never disobeyed a command in 3 years of service, suddenly can't focus on anything except you." Willow had no answer. Or rather, she had an answer she wasn't willing to give. "I don't know, sir." Blake's patience, never his strongest quality, finally snapped. "Get me her supply distribution records, now. Every piece of equipment she's touched, every bag of food she's handled. If there's something contaminated, I want to know about it." A junior petty officer scurried off to retrieve the paperwork. When the records arrived, Blake snatched them from the sailor's hands and began flipping through pages with barely controlled rage. After a moment, he stopped. Then he threw the entire folder into the air. Papers exploded outward, scattering across the training yard like oversized confetti. Supply logs, equipment manifests, feeding schedules, all of it drifting down to land in the Arizona dust. "Garbage," Blake spat. "This documentation is garbage. Incomplete, disorganized, worthless." He turned to face Willow, who had watched her work be destroyed without a single change in expression. "You're supposed to be maintaining these records? No wonder everything's falling apart." "The records were complete as of this morning, sir." Her voice remained steady, almost unnaturally so. "I can reorganize them if you'll give me time." "Time? You want time?" Blake laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "You've been here 2 weeks and you've already managed to compromise a multi-million-dollar K9 program. Time is exactly what you don't have." From across the yard, Mason Reed watched the confrontation with an expression that flickered between amusement and calculation. The specialist had been quiet all morning, staying on the periphery of activities, never quite engaging with the rest of the team. Now he moved. His path took him directly past Willow's supply cart. No one saw his boot connect with the wheel. The cart tipped sideways, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. Equipment spilled across the ground, leashes tangling together, collars rolling in different directions, training supplies scattering like dropped marbles. "Oh," Reed's voice dripped with mock concern. "I'm so sorry. Didn't see that there." He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Willow stood motionless for exactly 2 seconds. Then she knelt and began gathering the fallen equipment, her movements methodical and unhurried, despite the chaos surrounding her. Blake watched her for a moment, then turned away in disgust. "Someone get her out of my sight. This training session is suspended until we figure out what's wrong with these dogs." As Willow collected supplies, her hands trembled slightly. but anyone looking closely would have noticed something unusual about that tremor. It wasn't fear. It was suppressed anger, held in check by a will strong enough to bend steel. The sun had begun its descent toward the mountains by the time the equipment was restored to order. Doc Caleb Freeman found Willow in the supply shed, reorganizing the items that had been scattered across the yard. "Need a hand?" She looked up, surprised. The base medic was a compact man in his early 40s, with gentle eyes that seemed out of place in a military environment. He held out a few training collars he'd picked up from the ground. "Thank you." She accepted them, adding them to the appropriate shelf. "You didn't have to do that." "Neither did you." Freeman set down a crate of bite sleeves that someone had kicked into the corner. "You could have complained, filed a grievance, demanded respect." Willow's lips curved in something that might have been a smile. "Would that have helped?" "Probably not, but it might have made you feel better." "Feeling better isn't why I'm here." The words hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than their surface meaning suggested. Freeman studied her for a moment, really studied her, and something flickered in his expression. "You're not what you appear to be, are you?" Willow carefully aligned a row of tactical harnesses. "I'm a K9 supply clerk. That's what my badge says." "Badges can lie." Freeman lowered his voice. "I served in Fallujah back in 2004. Combat medic attached to a K9 unit. I've seen a lot of handlers in my time, good ones and bad ones. The way you touch that equipment, the way you move when the dogs are nearby." He paused. "That's not something you learn from a civilian training program." For a moment, Willow's careful mask slipped. Just a fraction of an inch, just long enough for Freeman to glimpse something underneath. Something hard and sharp and forged in places most people couldn't imagine. Then it was gone. "I appreciate your concern, Doc, but I'm just here to do my job." Freeman nodded slowly. "Sure. Just know that if you ever need medical attention, my door is open. No questions asked." He left her alone with the equipment and the silence and the growing shadows of evening. Across the compound, Senior Chief Ethan Graves stood in the shade of the communications building, his phone pressed to his ear. The setting sun painted his face in shades of orange and red as he spoke in low tones to whoever was on the other end of the line. "Confirm. Package is in place." A pause. "No, they don't suspect anything. She's playing her part perfectly. Too perfectly, if you ask me. That woman has more control than any operator I've ever worked with." Another pause. "Understood. We'll proceed as planned. But sir, if they push her too hard, if they put hands on her..." He listened for a moment, then exhaled. "Yes, sir. I know she can handle herself. That's exactly what I'm worried about. Graves out." He ended the call and stood watching the supply shed for a long moment. Inside, he could see Willow's silhouette moving behind the dusty windows, still organizing, still maintaining her cover despite everything that had been thrown at her. Somewhere in the kennels, 15 dogs had begun to howl. The next morning arrived wrapped in a pre-dawn chill that would burn off within hours. Willow was already at work when the first personnel began trickling onto the base, her cart loaded with the day's equipment requests. She'd made it halfway across the yard when the voice stopped her. "Hey, Willow! Wait up!" Corporal Noah Bennett jogged over, a young man with earnest eyes and the kind of energy that suggested he still believed in things. He'd been assigned to the K9 unit 3 months ago, fresh from handler training, and he carried himself with the awkward enthusiasm of someone who wanted desperately to prove himself. "I saw what happened yesterday," he said, slightly out of breath. "The way they treated you, it wasn't right." Willow paused, her expression neutral. "It's fine, Corporal. Just a misunderstanding." It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was harassment. Bennett glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "Look, I know I'm just a junior guy here, but if you need someone to vouch for your work, to tell the commander that your records were accurate before Lieutenant Commander Thornton destroyed them, I can do that." For the first time since she'd arrived at Fort Sentinel, something resembling warmth flickered across Willow's face. "That's kind of you." But I can handle it. You shouldn't have to handle it alone. The words seemed to strike something deep inside her. Her hand moved unconsciously to her left shoulder, pressing against a spot beneath her shirt where fabric hid skin that wasn't smooth anymore. Thank you, Noah. She used his first name deliberately, a small gift of familiarity. Really, but the best thing you can do is focus on your training. These dogs deserve handlers who know what they're doing. Speaking of which, Bennett hesitated. I've been having trouble with Shadow. She won't respond to my recall commands. The other handlers say I'm too soft, that I need to be more dominant, but that doesn't feel right. She's not responding to dominance from anyone. Willow considered for a moment. When you call her, what do you do with your body? I stand up straight, give the command clearly, maintain eye contact. Show me. Bennett demonstrated his stance, and immediately Willow saw the problem. His shoulders were squared, but his weight was back on his heels. His voice was clear, but his breathing was shallow. He was projecting authority without believing in it, and dogs could sense that kind of incongruence from a mile away. You're thinking about the command, she said. Don't think. Know. When you call Shadow, you're not asking her to come. You're telling the universe that she's already on her way. The command is just a formality. Bennett blinked. That sounds more like philosophy than dog training. Good training is philosophy. The best handlers I've ever... She stopped abruptly, catching herself. The best handlers I've ever read about understood that dogs respond to intention, not just sound. Try it again, but this time, picture Shadow already standing in front of you before you open your mouth. He tried. His stance shifted subtly, weight forward, breathing deepening. When he spoke the command this time, there was something different in his voice. 50 feet away, Shadow lifted her head. Bennett's eyes went wide. She heard me. She actually heard me. She was always hearing you. Now you're speaking her language. Willow resumed pushing her cart, the conversation apparently over. Good luck with your training, Corporal. She was gone before Bennett could ask how a supply clerk knew more about dog behavior than handlers with years of experience. From his position near the mess hall, Silas Porter had witnessed the entire exchange. The old gunnery sergeant pulled out his phone and typed a message to his former commanding officer. Need info on civilian contractor at Fort Sentinel. Name on badge, Willow. No last name given. Something's not right. The response came 3 minutes later. Can't access civilian records without authorization. What's your concern? Porter typed back. She knows things. Things she shouldn't know. Either she's lying about who she is, or we've got a serious security breach. Either way, I need to know more. He sent the message and settled in to wait. Meanwhile, Fiona Burke had been watching the morning's events unfold from her position outside the administrative building. The civilian contractor, a cheerful woman in her 50s who handled base communications, approached Willow's cart as it passed. Rough couple of days, huh? Willow slowed but didn't stop. I've had worse. I bet you have. Fiona fell into step beside her. Listen, I've been working on military bases for 20 years. I've seen how they treat contractors, especially women. If you want to file a formal complaint, I can help you navigate the paperwork. That won't be necessary. It's your right, you know. What Thornton did yesterday, throwing your records everywhere, what Reed did with your cart, that's workplace harassment. There are protections. Willow's cartwheels squeaked against the ground, a rhythmic sound that filled the pause before she spoke. Sometimes the best way to handle a situation isn't through official channels. What does that mean? It means that some things have to play out on their own timeline. Paperwork can wait. The truth can't. Fiona opened her mouth to ask what on earth that was supposed to mean, but Willow had already increased her pace, cart rattling as she headed toward the training area where the SEAL team was assembling for another day of exercises. The truth, as it turned out, couldn't wait much longer at all. The training session had been in progress for 45 minutes when things began to go wrong again. Blake Thornton stood in the center of the demonstration area, his patience already worn thin from the previous day's failures. Beside him, Shadow stood at attention, her sleek form motionless except for the occasional twitch of her ears. "Watch carefully," Blake announced to the assembled handlers. "This is how you establish dominance with a canine partner. The dog needs to understand that you are the alpha, period. No exceptions, no negotiations." He reached down to adjust Shadow's collar, his movements rough and efficient. The dog's lip curled. "Higher, Shadow, heel." Shadow didn't move. Her eyes had found a point across the yard, fixed there with an intensity that seemed to border on obsession. Blake followed her gaze and felt his jaw tighten. "Willow, again." "Get her out of here." Blake's voice came out as a growl. "I don't care what she's delivering. I don't care what her assignment is. Get that woman away from my training area." Two junior sailors started toward the supply cart, but before they could reach it, Shadow did something that made everyone freeze. She walked away from Blake, not ran, not bolted. Walked, with the calm deliberation of an animal who had made a decision and saw no reason to hurry about executing it. She crossed the yard in a straight line, ignoring Blake's increasingly frantic commands, and sat down directly at Willow's feet. Tail wagging. The silence that followed was so complete that you could hear the wind rustling through the desert scrub outside the fence. "What?" Blake's voice had gone hoarse. "What did you do to my dog?" Willow stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, making no move to touch Shadow despite the dog's obvious desire for attention. "I didn't do anything, sir. She came to me on her own." Dogs don't come to people on their own. Not military dogs. Not dogs with millions of dollars of training invested in them. Blake was striding across the yard now, his face darkening with each step. "You've been tampering with these animals. I don't know how, I don't know why, but I'm going to find out." "Sir, I assure you—" "Don't." He was close enough now that Willow had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Don't assure me of anything. You're a supply clerk. You hand out equipment. That's it. So why does a $500,000 military working dog act like you're her long-lost best friend?" From across the yard, Carter Mills had begun walking toward the confrontation, his security instincts triggered by the rising tension. Behind him, Silas Porter and Noah Bennett exchanged glances. "Maybe," Willow said quietly, "she just knows something you don't." The words were so soft that Blake almost missed them. When they registered, his expression shifted from anger to something uglier. "What did you say to me?" "Nothing, sir. I apologize." But the damage was done. "Get a leash on that dog," Blake snapped at the nearest handler. "And you," he pointed at Willow. "Don't move, don't speak, don't even breathe unless I tell you to. I'm getting to the bottom of this right now." Shadow had to be physically restrained as they pulled her away from Willow. The dog's whines cut through the desert air, high and plaintive, and utterly unlike the sound a trained military animal was supposed to make. 3 other dogs had begun pulling at their handlers, straining toward the same point of focus. Then 4, then 5. Silas Porter felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. In 30 years of military service, including 2 combat deployments with K9 units, he had never seen anything like this. Dogs didn't behave this way. Not without reason. Not without a bond. Amber Sutton stepped forward, her expression a mixture of triumph and malice. "It's obvious what's happening here. She's been sneaking into the kennels at night, feeding them treats, conditioning them to respond to her. It's a classic manipulation tactic." "I have not entered the kennels at any time," Willow replied. Her voice remained steady, but there was something new underneath it now, a hardness that hadn't been there before. "Then explain this." Amber gestured at the dogs, several of which were now actively fighting their handlers' control. "Explain why animals that have never shown the slightest behavioral issues are suddenly acting like they've found their mother." Willow's hands flexed at her sides, then stilled. "I can't explain it." "You can't or you won't. Does it matter?" The question hung in the air, dangerous and weighted with implications that Amber wasn't equipped to understand. But before she could respond, a new player entered the scene. Master-at-Arms Carter Mills had completed his approach and now stood at the edge of the gathering crowd. "What's going on here?" Security breach. Blake turned to face him. This civilian has been compromising our K-9 assets. I want her credentials checked, her background investigated, and her access to this facility revoked pending a full review. Mills studied Willow with those cold, calculating eyes. Is there any evidence of actual wrongdoing? The evidence is right there. Blake pointed at the dogs, still straining and whining. That's not normal behavior. Someone caused it. Being popular with animals isn't a crime, Lieutenant Commander. It is when it interferes with a multi-million-dollar military program. Mills considered this. His gaze moved from Blake to Willow to the agitated dogs and back again. Finally, he pulled out a small tablet and began typing. I'll run her background again. If there's anything suspicious, we'll find it. He looked at Willow directly. You. Stay on base until this is resolved. Don't attempt to leave the facility. Yes, sir. Mills walked away, already focused on his tablet. Blake watched him go, then turned back to Willow. This isn't over, he said softly. Not by a long shot. He stalked back to the training area, barking orders at his handlers to regain control of their animals. The session resumed, but the energy had changed. There was an undercurrent now, a tension that hadn't existed before. And 15 dogs kept looking toward the woman with the supply cart, waiting for something that only they understood. The results of the background check came back 2 hours later. Mills stood in Colonel Hayes' office, the tablet displaying Willow's civilian contractor file on its screen. The base commander sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable as he reviewed the information. Clean, Mills reported. No criminal record, no military service history, previous employment at various civilian logistics companies. References check out. On paper, she's exactly what she claims to be. Hayes tapped his finger against the desk. On paper. Sir? You said on paper. That implies you have concerns off paper. Mills hesitated, choosing his words carefully. There are inconsistencies. The way she handles equipment suggests training that isn't reflected in her background. Her composure under pressure is unusual for a civilian, and the dog's reaction to her presence is unprecedented in my experience. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, sir. I'm reporting observations. Mills straightened his posture. But if I were to speculate, I would say that either her records have been falsified, or she's operating under some kind of classified cover that we don't have clearance to access. Hayes was quiet for a long moment. His eyes drifted to the window where the training yard was visible in the afternoon light. Somewhere out there, a woman was going about her business as if the entire base hadn't spent the morning trying to figure out who she really was. Maintain surveillance, Hayes said finally. But don't interfere with her movements unless she does something overtly suspicious. If she's who she says she is, we don't need a harassment lawsuit. And if she's not... He paused. Well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Yes, sir. Mills left the office, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Behind him, Colonel Hayes picked up his secure phone and dialed a number that only a handful of people in the world knew existed. The line connected after 3 rings. This is Hayes at Fort Sentinel. I need information on a civilian contractor currently working at my facility. Name on file is Willow, no surname given. Badge number 7734. He listened for a moment. Yes, I'll hold. The hold lasted 4 minutes. When the voice returned, Hayes's expression underwent a subtle transformation. His eyes widened slightly. His grip on the phone tightened, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted from casual inquiry to something approaching reverence. I understand. Yes, sir. No, sir, there won't be any interference from my end. I'll ensure she has everything she needs. A pause. Thank you for the clarification, Admiral. He hung up and stared at the phone for a long moment. Then he began to laugh. Evening descended on Fort Sentinel, painting the desert in shades of purple and gold. The day's training had concluded with minimal success, the dogs still distracted, the handlers still frustrated, and the mystery of the supply clerk still unsolved. Willow sat alone in the equipment shed, the door closed against the cooling air. Around her, the tools of her supposed trade lined the walls: harnesses, collars, leashes, training aids. She ran her fingers over a tactical vest designed for canine combat operations, her touch lingering on the Velcro patches where unit insignias would normally be displayed. Empty patches, waiting for identity. She reached beneath the workbench and pressed a hidden release. A section of floor lifted silently, revealing a compartment that shouldn't have existed in a simple storage building. Inside, nestled in foam padding, lay a Glock 19, a encrypted satellite radio, and a badge that gleamed dully in the fading light. NCIS Special Agent. She didn't touch any of it, just looked, confirmed, then closed the compartment and returned the floor to its seamless appearance. A soft knock on the door made her tense. "It's me." Ethan Graves' voice, low and careful. "We need to talk." She opened the door. The senior chief slipped inside, closing it behind him with the practiced silence of someone who had spent decades moving through places he wasn't supposed to be. "They're getting suspicious," Graves said without preamble. "Mills ran your background twice today. Hayes made a call to someone above his pay grade, and Thornton is one bad moment away from doing something we can't easily explain away." "I know." "Then maybe it's time to accelerate the timeline. You've confirmed Reed is the contact. We have enough for an arrest." Willow shook her head. "Reed is a delivery boy. We need his handler. We need the network." "And if they expose you first?" "They won't." Graves studied her face in the dim light. He'd worked with some of the best operators in the business, men and women who had done things that would never appear in any official record. But this woman was different. There was something in her eyes that went beyond training, beyond discipline, something that had been forged in fire and come out harder than diamond. "The dogs know who you are," he said quietly. "They've known since the moment you set foot on this base. How long before someone figures out why?" "The dogs won't betray me." "No, but their behavior might." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Reed made a call tonight, to a number in Mexico. We intercepted it, but the encryption is military grade. Someone's feeding the cartel information from inside this facility." "I know who it is." "Then why wait?" Willow's smile was thin and cold. "Because I want them all, and because I want them to know exactly who took them down." Graves nodded slowly. "Just be careful, Phantom. These people play rough." "So do I." He left without another word, and Willow returned to her solitary vigil among the equipment and shadows. Somewhere in the kennels, 15 dogs had begun to howl again, their voices rising into the desert night like a chorus of recognition, like a welcome home. The next morning brought a surprise. Colonel Hayes had called an emergency briefing for all senior personnel, his message carrying an urgency that set nerves on edge throughout the base. By 0800 hours, the command center was packed with officers, NCOs, and key civilian staff. Blake Thornton stood near the front, arms crossed, expression set in its default state of aggressive confidence. Beside him, Amber, Derek, and the rest of the SEAL contingent formed a wall of muscle and attitude. Carter Mills had positioned himself near the door, his security instincts keeping him close to the exit. Silas Porter sat in the back, watching everything with the quiet attention of a man who had learned long ago that the most important information often came from what wasn't said. Hayes entered the room and took his position at the podium without preamble. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'll keep this brief. We have received intelligence indicating that a smuggling operation is using the border corridor near Fort Sentinel as a transit route. More concerning, there are indications that this operation may have sources inside our facility." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Effective immediately, all personnel will undergo enhanced security screening. Access to sensitive areas will be restricted, and anyone with information about unauthorized contacts or suspicious activity is ordered to report it through proper channels." Hayes's gaze swept the room. This is not a drill. We have reason to believe that classified information about our K-9 operations has been compromised. Blake stepped forward. Sir, with respect, do we have any suspects? The investigation is ongoing, Lieutenant Commander, but I will say this. Hayes's eyes seemed to linger on a particular section of the room. The guilty parties will be identified, they will be apprehended, and they will face the full consequences of their actions. Make no mistake about that. The briefing concluded with standard security reminders, but the atmosphere had shifted fundamentally. Suspicion hung in the air like smoke after a fire, and everyone was looking at everyone else with new eyes. Except for Mason Reed, who had spent the entire briefing staring at his hands. Willow wasn't at the briefing. As a civilian contractor, she hadn't been included in the distribution. But Fiona Burke filled her in on the details when they crossed paths near the communications building. They're saying there's a mole, Fiona reported, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Someone's been feeding information to the cartels. Can you believe it? Right here on base. That's concerning, Willow said, her expression carefully neutral. Concerning? It's terrifying. I've been working on military installations for 20 years, and I've never seen security this tight. They're checking everyone's communications, everyone's contacts. It's like being back in the Cold War. I'm sure they'll find whoever's responsible. Fiona studied her for a moment. You don't seem surprised. Should I be? Most people would be. Most people would be panicking right now, wondering if they're going to be suspected, wondering if their background check is going to turn up something embarrassing. Fiona tilted her head. But you're calm, like you knew this was coming. Willow's lips curved in that small, enigmatic smile. I've learned not to panic about things outside my control. If the security team wants to investigate me, they're welcome to try. They won't find anything. That's very confident. It's very honest. She excused herself and continued toward the training area, where the morning exercises were about to begin. Behind her, Fiona watched her go with an expression of deepening puzzlement. Something about that woman didn't add up, and Fiona Burke had learned long ago to pay attention when things didn't add up. The K-9 training session was already in progress when Willow arrived with her equipment cart. Blake had positioned himself at the center of the demonstration area, his body language radiating the kind of aggressive authority that had probably worked well for him in combat zones, but was proving less effective with 70-pound Belgian Malinois. Today's exercise is search and apprehension, he announced. Each handler will take their assigned dog through the obstacle course, locate the hidden target, and demonstrate proper takedown technique. The handlers moved to their positions. One by one, the dogs were released into the course, their muscles bunching and releasing as they navigated barriers, tunnels, and elevated platforms. Most performed admirably, their training evident in every movement. Rex was assigned to go last. This is the one that matters, Blake said, attaching his personal leash to the big Malinois' collar. Rex is the alpha of this pack. If he performs well, the others will follow his lead. He led Rex to the starting position, unclipped the leash, and gave the command. Rex didn't move. Voran, Blake repeated, using the German command for forward. Rex, Voran! The dog's eyes had found Willow again. She was standing near the equipment cart, making no effort to attract attention, but it didn't matter. Rex's entire being was oriented toward her like a compass needle toward magnetic north. Blake's face darkened. This is ridiculous. Every single time that woman is anywhere near this yard, the dogs lose their minds. He spun toward Carter Mills, who was observing from the sidelines. I want her removed, now. Her presence is compromising this entire operation. Mills hesitated. After his conversation with Colonel Hayes, he was operating under new orders that he couldn't explain to anyone. But those orders hadn't included watching valuable military assets become worthless. Ma'am, he said, approaching Willow with careful neutrality, perhaps it would be best if you completed your supply duties in a different area today. Willow nodded. Of course. She began to push her cart toward the exit, but Rex had other ideas. The moment she turned away, the big Malinois exploded into motion, not toward the obstacle course, not toward his handler, but directly toward the woman who was trying to leave. His paws ate up the distance in seconds, his body a blur of tan fur and pure determination. Blake shouted commands that went unheeded. Handlers scrambled to intercept. Carter Mills reached for his sidearm, training overriding judgment for a critical moment. None of them were fast enough. Rex reached Willow and sat. Just sat. Right at her feet, his tail sweeping the dirt, his tongue lolling, his entire body vibrating with an emotion that looked impossibly like joy. The silence that followed was absolute. Then the other dogs began to break formation. Shadow pulled free of her handler's grip. Ghost followed, then Titan, then Luna. One by one, all 15 Belgian Malinois abandoned their positions and converged on the woman with the supply cart, arranging themselves around her in a formation that every canine professional on the yard recognized immediately. Protective circle. Alpha defense pattern. These dogs, these highly trained military assets worth millions of dollars, had just declared their allegiance, and it wasn't to anyone wearing a uniform. We're about to reach the most intense moment of this story. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss our daily military content. Share this video with someone who respects our canine heroes and their handlers. The reveal coming up will change everything you thought you knew about Willow. Stay with us. Silas Porter was the first to break the silence. "Holy cow," he breathed, the words carrying clearly in the stillness. "I've never seen anything like this in my life." Blake Thornton's face had gone through several colors in the past 30 seconds, cycling from red to white to a shade of purple that suggested imminent cardiac distress. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and when he spoke, his voice came out as something between a whisper and a scream. "What is happening?" "I think that's fairly obvious, Lieutenant Commander." The voice came from Colonel Hayes, who had emerged from the command building at some point during the chaos. He stood at the edge of the training yard, his expression unreadable. "These dogs have chosen their handler." "That's not how it works." Blake's composure finally shattered completely. "Military working dogs don't choose handlers. They're trained, they're conditioned, they're programmed to follow commands. They don't just walk away from their assigned personnel to sit at the feet of some random supply clerk." "Unless," Hayes said calmly, "she's not a random supply clerk." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Ripples of understanding began to spread across the faces of those assembled, but the full picture remained just out of reach. Amber Sutton stepped forward, her earlier malice replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like fear. "Sir, what are you saying? Who is she?" Hayes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and withdrew his phone, typing a message with the kind of deliberate calm that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment. "I received a call last night," he said, still focused on his phone. "From Admiral Solomon Caldwell. Some of you may recognize that name. For those who don't, he's the commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare Command, the man who oversees every SEAL operation on the planet." Blake's face went completely white. "Admiral Caldwell called you? About what?" "About her." Hayes nodded toward Willow, who remained at the center of her canine honor guard, her expression still carefully neutral. "About who she really is and why she's really here." "And who is she?" Before Hayes could answer, the sound of an engine cut through the tension. A black SUV with government plates was pulling through the main gate, moving with the kind of purposeful speed that suggested its passengers were not accustomed to waiting. "I think," Hayes said, "you're about to find out." The SUV stopped at the edge of the training yard. Both front doors opened simultaneously, revealing two men in civilian clothes who nonetheless carried themselves with unmistakable military bearing. They scanned the area with professional efficiency, confirmed the situation, and then opened the rear door. Senior Chief Ethan Graves stepped out, but not as the observer he'd been pretending to be. This time, he wore his credentials openly, a badge that gleamed in the morning sun, identifying him as exactly what Willow had known him to be all along. NCIS. "Ladies and gentlemen," Graves announced, his voice carrying easily across the yard, This facility is now under federal investigation. No one leaves until we've completed our interviews. Blake sputtered. On what authority? What investigation? What is going on? Graves ignored him, turning instead toward the woman surrounded by dogs. Master Chief, we have confirmation. The package is ready for delivery. Willow nodded once, a barely perceptible movement that nonetheless carried the weight of command. Status of the primary target? Attempting to flee. Our people have him contained. Across the yard, Mason Reed had begun edging toward the far exit. His movements were casual, designed to avoid attention, but 3 of the dogs had already broken from the protective circle and positioned themselves between him and his escape route. Their growls were low and unmistakable. Going somewhere, Specialist? Willow's voice had changed. Gone was the soft, apologetic tone she'd used for 2 weeks. In its place was something harder, sharper, forged in places most people couldn't imagine. I'd recommend staying where you are. Ghost has a 97% apprehension rate, and he hasn't had breakfast yet. Reed froze. His eyes darted between the dogs, the NCIS agents, and the woman he'd helped torment for 2 weeks. When he spoke, his voice cracked. I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't done anything. That's interesting. Willow began walking toward him, the dogs parting to let her through like water around a ship's prow. Because I have recordings of every call you've made to your contact in Sonora, every piece of information you've passed along, every patrol schedule, every K-9 deployment, every security rotation. She stopped 3 feet away, close enough that Reed could see the transformation in her eyes. This wasn't the timid supply clerk he'd kicked and mocked and dismissed. This was something else entirely. You've been selling intelligence to the Reynosa cartel for 8 months, she continued. 3 border agents are dead because of information you provided. 2 K-9 handlers were ambushed on patrol because you told them exactly where to find them. Her voice dropped to a whisper. And you thought you could hide all of that from me. Reed's face had gone gray. Who are you? Willow reached up and did something she'd been wanting to do since the moment she set foot on this base. She pulled the civilian contractor badge from her neck and dropped it in the dirt. Master Chief Jade Holloway, Naval Criminal Investigative Service, call sign, Phantom. She smiled, and there was nothing warm about it. I believe we have some things to discuss, Specialist. The arrest happened quickly after that. Reed was cuffed and led to the waiting SUV, his earlier swagger completely evaporated. Graves coordinated with his team while the base personnel watched in stunned silence, still processing the magnitude of what they'd witnessed. But the revelation wasn't complete. Blake Thornton stood rooted to his position, his face cycling through emotions too complex to name. Shock, certainly. Confusion, definitely. But underneath all of that, something that looked uncomfortable, like the first stirrings of shame. Master Chief, he managed, his voice hoarse. He trailed off, unable to find words adequate to the situation. Jade turned to face him. She was still surrounded by dogs, still wearing the stained clothes of a supply clerk, still carrying herself with that quiet stillness that had fooled everyone. But something fundamental had shifted in the way she occupied space. She wasn't hiding anymore. You wanted to know why these dogs responded to me, she said. Why they kept looking at me, coming to me, ignoring your commands. Blake nodded mutely. These 15 dogs were part of Operation Shadow Border, a classified mission in 2019 to intercept cartel smuggling routes along the Arizona corridor. She reached down and scratched behind Rex's ears, the gesture automatic and familiar. I trained them, worked with them for 18 months, led them on 47 operations. She paused, her hand resting on Rex's broad head. I was their handler, their alpha, and no matter how many years pass, no matter how many other people try to take that place, these dogs never forget. As if to emphasize her point, Rex pressed his head against her palm, his eyes closing in an expression of perfect contentment. Amber Sutton had begun to cry. Not dramatically, not seeking attention, but with the quiet tears of someone who had just realized the full extent of their own mistakes. Derek Walsh stared at the ground, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Carter Mills had removed his cap and was holding it against his chest, his posture shifting to something that looked remarkably like the beginning of a salute. And Silas Porter, the old gunnery sergeant who had suspected from the beginning, was smiling. "Master Chief," he said, stepping forward, "I served in Afghanistan with the 47th K9 unit. We heard stories about Ghost Handler, about a woman who could make any dog follow her anywhere, do anything. A woman who saved 23 Border Patrol agents during a cartel ambush by sending her dogs ahead to locate the enemy positions." He came to attention. "I never believed those stories were true. I thought they were just legends we told to inspire the new handlers." His hand rose in a crisp salute. "I'm honored to know they were real." Jade returned the salute with equal precision. "The stories usually exaggerate, Gunny. It was only 19 agents. Still, that's 19 families who got their people back because of you." The moment stretched, filled with the kind of respect that couldn't be demanded or purchased. It had to be earned, one sacrifice at a time, one mission at a time, one dog at a time, and Jade had earned it many times over. But the morning's revelations weren't finished yet. Colonel Hayes approached, his phone still in his hand, his expression carrying news that clearly required immediate attention. "Master Chief, I have Admiral Caldwell on the line. He's requesting a status update." Jade accepted the phone, bringing it to her ear. "Phantom here, sir." The voice that came through was tired but satisfied. "Outstanding work, Master Chief. Reed's arrest is already generating intelligence. His contacts are scrambling, making mistakes. We've identified 3 more potential sources inside other facilities." "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me yet. There's a complication." Caldwell's tone shifted. "Reed wasn't working alone. We've intercepted communications suggesting a much larger network than we initially suspected. Someone higher up the food chain, someone with access to classified K9 deployment schedules across multiple bases." Jade's eyes narrowed. "Do we have a name?" "Not yet, but we have a location. A facility in Texas, near the border. They're running some kind of unauthorized K9 program, training dogs for purposes that aren't in any official record. You want me to investigate. I want you to do what you do best, Phantom. Disappear, observe, and when the time comes, show them exactly what a ghost can do." Jade looked around the training yard, at the dogs who had waited years to see her again, at the personnel who had just learned that everything they thought they knew was wrong, at the Arizona sun beating down on a world that had suddenly become much more complicated. "When do I leave, sir?" 48 hours. Take the time to debrief, recover, and say your goodbyes." "And Master Chief?" "Sir?" "Choose one dog to take with you. Just one. The rest stay here for the official program." Jade's gaze swept across the 15 Malinois still arranged around her. Rex, the leader. Shadow, the most obedient. Ghost, the fastest. Titan, the strongest. And Luna, the smallest of the pack, the only female. The one who had proven herself time and again by doing what others thought impossible. "I understand, sir. Phantom out." She handed the phone back to Hayes, her mind already racing through the implications of what she'd just learned. The mission at Fort Sentinel was complete, but a larger threat had emerged from the shadows, and she had 48 hours to prepare for whatever came next. The aftermath of the morning's events unfolded with a mixture of official procedures and personal reckonings. Reed was transported to a federal detention facility for interrogation. The base was placed on modified lockdown while NCIS conducted preliminary interviews. And the personnel who had spent 2 weeks tormenting a supply clerk were forced to confront the magnitude of their error. Blake Thornton found Jade near the kennels that afternoon. She was sitting on a bench outside Rex's enclosure, watching the dogs settle into their afternoon rest. Her posture was relaxed, her expression thoughtful, showing no sign of the tension that had defined her undercover persona. "Permission to speak, Master Chief?" She glanced up, her eyes carrying none of the deference she'd shown before. "Granted." He stood at attention, shoulders squared, jaw tight. "I owe you an apology, not just for the disrespect, but for the failures of judgment that made it possible. I saw what I expected to see. A civilian. Someone beneath my notice. I never stopped to question whether my assumptions were correct." "No," Jade agreed. "You didn't. That's on me. The Navy trains us to assess situations accurately, to look beyond surface appearances, to recognize that threats and allies don't always wear the uniforms we expect." His voice roughened. "I failed that training. And I failed you. You failed yourself, Lieutenant Commander. I was never in any real danger from your disrespect." She stood, her eyes level with his, despite the height difference. "But what about the next person? The next civilian contractor who isn't a decorated Master Chief with federal credentials? What happens when you decide they're beneath your notice?" Blake had no answer. "The Navy gave you a trident," Jade continued. "It gave you authority over men and women who trust you with their lives. That's a responsibility, not a privilege. And the moment you start treating anyone as less than human, you've already lost the right to wear it." She walked past him, heading toward the command building. Then she stopped. "For what it's worth," she said without turning around, "the fact that you're here, apologizing, instead of making excuses, that's something. It doesn't fix what happened, but it's a start." She continued walking, leaving Blake alone with the weight of his failures and the uncertain hope of redemption. The rest of the day passed in a blur of interviews, paperwork, and the endless bureaucratic machinery that kicked into gear whenever a federal investigation intersected with military operations. Jade answered questions, provided documentation, and coordinated with Graves on the intelligence that Reed's arrest had generated. But as evening approached, she found herself drawn back to the kennels. The dogs were awake now, their evening energy building as the desert cooled. 15 pairs of eyes tracked her approach, and 15 tails began to wag with varying degrees of enthusiasm. She walked along the row of enclosures, pausing at each one to scratch an ear or offer a word of acknowledgement. Shadow pressed against her fence, whining softly. Ghost barked once, short and sharp, demanding attention. Titan sat with regal dignity, accepting her greeting as his due. Rex was last. The big Malinois was standing when she reached his enclosure, his body vibrating with barely contained excitement. She opened the gate and stepped inside, closing it behind her. "Hey, old friend." Rex practically bowled her over, his enthusiasm undiminished by years of separation. She caught herself against the fence, laughing as 90 pounds of military working dog tried to climb into her lap. "Easy, easy. I missed you too." She slid down to sit on the ground, Rex immediately positioning himself across her legs like an oversized puppy. His head rested against her chest, his eyes closing in contentment. "You knew," she murmured, running her fingers through his fur. "From the moment I walked onto this base, you knew it was me." Rex's tail thumped against the ground. 3 years. 3 years since I last saw you and you remembered. You never stopped looking for me." The weight of those words settled around her like a blanket. 3 years since Operation Shadow Border. 3 years since the night that had earned her a silver star and a collection of scars she would carry forever. 3 years since a bullet meant for her head had found her shoulder instead, deflected by a dog who had thrown himself into the shooter's path. She touched the scar automatically. It ached sometimes, in cold weather or before storms. But it was also a reminder. Rex had saved her life that night, and she had spent the years since then trying to be worthy of his sacrifice. "I have to go," she said softly. "Another mission. Another ghost story." She tilted Rex's face up so she could look into his eyes. "I can't take you with me. You're too recognizable, too valuable to the program here. But I need you to do something for me." The dog's ears perked forward. "I need you to teach them." She nodded toward the training yard, toward the direction where Blake and his team had spent 2 weeks failing to understand what leadership really meant. Not the handlers. They'll figure it out eventually. I mean the other dogs, the new ones who come after you. Teach them what it means to be loyal. Teach them what it means to never give up on someone, no matter how long it takes. Rex's tongue swept across her face in a gesture of agreement. That's my boy. She stayed in the enclosure until the stars came out, surrounded by the smell of dog and dust and desert. For a few precious hours, she allowed herself to simply exist, without cover identities or mission objectives, or the weight of federal credentials. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, she was just a woman with her dog, watching the sky turn from orange to purple to infinite black. And that was enough. The morning of her second-to-last day at Fort Sentinel arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only desert dawns could produce. The sky shifted from deep indigo to pale gold as Jade stood on the observation deck outside the barracks, watching the base come alive below her. Rex lay at her feet, having been granted special permission to stay with her overnight. The big Malinois had refused to leave her side since the revelation, and Colonel Hayes had decided that arguing with a 90-pound military working dog was not how he wanted to spend his evening. "You're up early." Jade turned to find Silas Porter climbing the stairs to the deck, 2 cups of coffee steaming in his hands. He offered one to her without asking if she wanted it. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted, accepting the cup. "Too much running through my head." "I can imagine." Porter settled against the railing beside her, his own gaze sweeping across the compound. "Yesterday was quite a show. Haven't seen that many people lose their composure since the time a senator's son tried to tell a sergeant major how to run PT drills." Despite everything, Jade smiled. "How did that end?" "About how you'd expect. The kid learned a valuable lesson about the difference between authority and rank." Porter sipped his coffee. "Speaking of which, I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For not destroying them." He nodded toward the row of officer quarters, where Blake Thornton and his team were presumably still processing the previous day's events. "You could have. You had every right to file formal complaints, request disciplinary action, make their lives very difficult. Instead, you let them off with nothing but their own shame." Jade was quiet for a moment, watching Rex's ears twitch in his sleep. Shame is a better teacher than punishment. You can resent a reprimand, you can appeal a demotion, but you can't escape the memory of who you were when you thought no one was watching. That's either very wise or very generous. Maybe both. She turned to face him fully. "Gunny, can I ask you something?" "Shoot." "You suspected me from the beginning. I saw it in your eyes that first day. Why didn't you say anything?" Porter considered the question, rolling his coffee cup between his palms. "2 reasons. First, I wasn't certain. Suspicion isn't the same as knowledge, and I've seen too many witch hunts started by people who confused the two." He paused. "Second, I figured if you were hiding something, you probably had a good reason. The way you handled yourself, the way you stayed calm when they were throwing your equipment around and calling you names. That wasn't someone who was afraid of being caught. That was someone with a mission. You trusted me. I trusted my instincts. They've kept me alive through 3 combat deployments. I wasn't about to start doubting them over a supply clerk who knew too much about tactical harnesses." Rex stirred at their feet, lifting his head to check on Jade before settling back down with a contented sigh. Porter watched the interaction with something approaching reverence. "He really does love you," he said quietly. "I've worked with a lot of canine teams. The bond between handler and dog is supposed to be unbreakable, but I've never seen anything like what I saw yesterday. Those dogs would have torn through anyone who tried to hurt you." "They're not just tools," Jade replied. "That's what people don't understand. You can train a dog to follow commands, to attack on cue, to search for explosives or track fugitives. But you can't train loyalty. That has to be earned, 1 day at a time, 1 moment at a time. It takes years to build, and seconds to destroy. And you built it. We built it together, Rex and Shadow and Ghost and all the others. We went through things that would break most partnerships, human or otherwise. When you survive that kind of crucible together, it creates something that transcends training. She finished her coffee and set the cup aside, her expression shifting to something more businesslike. I need to meet with Colonel Hayes this morning. There are details about the Texas facility that require coordination. But after that, I'd like to spend some time with the handlers. The real training, not the performance Thornton was putting on. Porter straightened. I'll make sure they're ready. Fair warning, though. They're going to have a lot of questions. I'd be disappointed if they didn't. The gunnery sergeant headed back down the stairs, his footsteps fading into the general noise of the waking base. Jade remained on the deck a moment longer, her hand resting on Rex's head, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains where the sun was just beginning to touch the peaks. 48 hours. Then Texas, and whatever waited for her there. But first, there was work to be done here. The meeting with Colonel Hayes was brief but productive. Intelligence from Reed's interrogation had confirmed the existence of a shadow network operating across multiple border facilities, coordinating smuggling operations with a sophistication that suggested military-trained leadership. We're calling it Operation Ghost Trail, Hayes explained, spreading a map across his desk. The Texas facility is here, near the border town of Presidio. On paper, it's a private security training company specializing in canine services. In reality, we believe they're training dogs for cartel operations. Drug detection dogs that can identify interdiction points, attack dogs for enforcement, possibly even dogs trained to carry small packages across unmonitored sections of the border. Jade studied the map, her mind already cataloging terrain features and potential infiltration routes. What's my cover? Civilian trainer. They're always looking for experienced handlers, and your credentials are impeccable, even the ones we didn't have to fabricate. Hayes smiled thinly. The irony isn't lost on me. You just finished pretending to be incompetent at a job you're actually better at than anyone else alive. Now you'll be pretending to be competent at a job you're actually trying to destroy. The universe has a sense of humor. Indeed it does. Hayes closed the folder containing the operational details. Master Chief, I want to say something before you leave, something personal. Jade waited. When Admiral Caldwell called me 2 weeks ago and told me that a decorated NCIS operative would be going undercover at my facility, I was skeptical. I've seen a lot of undercover work in my career, and most of it doesn't live up to the hype. Operators who can't maintain their cover, who crack under pressure, who let their egos compromise the mission. He met her eyes directly. You are not most operators. Thank you, sir. The things my people did to you, the disrespect, the harassment, I should have intervened. Cover or no cover, there are lines that shouldn't be crossed. If you had intervened, it would have raised questions that might have reached the wrong ears. Jade shook her head. You played your part perfectly, Colonel. The best thing you could have done was exactly what you did. Nothing. Hayes looked unconvinced but nodded. Will you be conducting any training sessions before you leave? With your permission, I'd like to work with the handlers, particularly the junior ones, and I'd like to address Lieutenant Commander Thornton's team directly. Address them how? Jade's smile carried an edge that suggested the session would be educational in ways that wouldn't appear in any training manual. I thought I'd show them what these dogs are really capable of, when they're working with someone who understands them. Hayes considered this for a moment, then nodded. Approved. Just try not to break anyone. No promises, sir. The training yard had been transformed by the time Jade arrived that afternoon. Word had spread throughout the base about the morning's scheduled demonstration, and what had been intended as a small instructional session had grown into something approaching a spectator event. Personnel lined the fences 3 deep. Officers who normally spent their days in climate-controlled offices had found reasons to conduct business outdoors. Even the mess hall staff had arranged their breaks to coincide with the demonstration. At the center of it all stood the 15 Belgian Malinois, arranged in a formation they hadn't displayed since Operation Shadow Border. They weren't restrained by leashes or handlers. They simply sat, 15 pairs of eyes fixed on the woman walking toward them across the packed dirt. Jade had changed out of her civilian contractor clothes. She now wore tactical pants, a fitted black t-shirt, and boots that had seen enough miles to earn their wear patterns honestly. Her hair was pulled back in a tight braid, and her movements carried the coiled energy of someone who had spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of moment. Blake Thornton stood at the edge of the formation, his face carefully neutral. Beside him, Amber, Derek, Carter, and the rest of the personnel who had made Jade's undercover week so memorable watched with expressions ranging from apprehension to outright fear. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jade began, her voice carrying easily across the yard, "for the past 2 weeks, you've watched Lieutenant Commander Thornton and his team attempt to establish command over these 15 military working dogs. You've seen them struggle with obedience, fight with compliance, and ultimately fail to achieve the kind of partnership that effective K-9 operations require." Blake's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. That failure wasn't because of defective equipment, insufficient training, or interference from supply personnel. Jade allowed her gaze to sweep across the assembled crowd. It was because they were trying to command respect instead of earning it. She turned to face the dogs, her back to the audience. "Watch." What happened next would be discussed around Fort Sentinel for years to come. Jade didn't speak, she didn't gesture. She simply stood there, completely still, her breathing slow and measured, her body language projecting an authority so absolute that it seemed to bend the very air around her. The dogs responded instantly. Rex rose first, crossing the 10 feet between them with silent purpose. He circled behind her, then sat at her left heel, his position as beta to her alpha established without a single command being spoken. Shadow followed, taking the right heel. Then Ghost, positioning himself 3 feet ahead, point position. Then Titan at rear guard. Then the others, each dog moving to a predetermined location like pieces on a chessboard, until Jade stood at the center of a tactical formation that would have taken months to train conventionally. She had established it in less than 30 seconds. The silence from the crowd was absolute. Jade raised her right hand, 2 fingers extended. The entire formation pivoted 90 degrees, moving as a single unit. She dropped her hand. They stopped. She made a fist. They tensed, ready for action. She opened her palm. They relaxed, all without a single word. "This," Jade said, finally turning back to face her audience, "is what a K-9 partnership is supposed to look like. Not handler and tool, not commander and subordinate. Partners, each one knowing their role, trusting the other to fulfill theirs, moving together as a single organism." She began walking toward the group of SEAL personnel, the dogs flowing around her like an honor guard. "Lieutenant Commander Thornton, you're a decorated Navy SEAL. You've completed some of the most demanding training the military has to offer. You've served in combat zones, led men into hostile territory, made life-and-death decisions under pressure." She stopped directly in front of him. "Why couldn't you get a single dog to follow a basic command?" Blake's face had gone red, but to his credit, he didn't flinch from the question. "Because I was treating them like subordinates instead of partners." Close, but not quite. Jade turned to address the wider group. He was treating them like objects, things to be controlled rather than beings to be understood. And dogs, unlike soldiers, don't respond to authority unless they believe the authority has been earned. She pointed at Amber Sutton. "Petty officer, you called me a supply girl who'd never seen a real military dog. What do you see now?" Amber's face had gone pale, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Someone who understands these animals better than I ever will." "And why is that?" "Because..." Amber struggled for words. "Because you respect them. You see them as equals." "Not equals. Partners," Jade corrected. "There's a difference. A partner can be different from you, can have different strengths and weaknesses, different ways of seeing the world. What matters isn't equality. What matters is mutual respect. She turned to Derek Walsh. Chief, you spent 8 years working with military dogs. In all that time, did you ever stop to ask yourself why they followed commands? Not how to make them follow, but why they chose to. Walsh's jaw worked silently for a moment. No, Master Chief, I didn't. That's the missing piece. Dogs don't follow commands because they're afraid of punishment or motivated by rewards. At least, not the truly exceptional ones. They follow commands because they trust their handler to lead them somewhere worth going. They believe that the person giving orders has their best interest at heart. She paused. That kind of trust isn't given. It's built. One interaction at a time, one decision at a time, one moment of genuine connection at a time. The demonstration continued for another hour, with Jade walking the assembled personnel through exercises designed to illustrate her points. She paired handlers with dogs they'd struggled to connect with, coaching them through new approaches that emphasized communication over command. She showed them how body language could replace verbal orders, how patience could overcome resistance, how genuine affection could unlock capabilities that force never could. By the end, several of the handlers were seeing their assigned dogs in an entirely new light. Blake Thornton was the last to approach her as the crowd began to disperse. Master Chief, may I have a moment? Jade nodded, waving off the dogs who had begun to gather protectively around her. Rex stayed, but the others moved to a respectful distance. I've been in the Navy for 15 years, Blake said quietly, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. I've led missions that most people will never hear about. I've made decisions that kept my teammates alive and sent enemies to their graves. I thought I understood leadership. He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to a man who had built his career on projecting confidence. I didn't understand anything, not really. Everything I thought I knew about command, about authority, about getting people to follow orders, it was all built on the assumption that I was somehow special, that my rank entitled me to respect. And now? Now I understand that respect is earned by how you treat people when you think no one is watching. By whether you see subordinates as tools to be used or partners to be valued. He met her eyes directly. You taught me that, Master Chief. Not through your credentials, or your reputation, or your fancy tactical demonstrations. You taught me by being someone who didn't deserve to be treated the way I treated you, and by handling that treatment with a grace I'm not sure I possess. Jade was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had softened slightly. You're wrong about that last part, Lieutenant Commander. Everyone possesses grace. The question is whether they choose to exercise it. She extended her hand. Blake took it, his grip firm but not aggressive. I won't pretend that the last 2 weeks didn't happen, Jade continued. I won't forget the things that were said or the ways I was treated. But I also won't let those things define the future. You made mistakes. You acknowledged them. Now you have a choice to make. What choice? The choice of who you want to be going forward. The person who treated a supply clerk like garbage because she seemed beneath him, or the person who learned from that experience and decided to be better. She released his hand. The dogs will know which one you choose. They always do. Blake nodded slowly. Thank you, Master Chief, for the lesson, and for the second chance. Don't thank me. Earn it. She walked away, Rex falling into step beside her, leaving Blake Thornton standing alone with the weight of his past and the possibility of his future. The final evening at Fort Sentinel arrived with a sunset that painted the sky in shades of fire and blood. Jade had spent the afternoon reviewing final briefings for the Texas operation and coordinating with Graves on logistics for her departure. Now she sat in the kennels, surrounded by dogs who seemed to sense that something significant was coming to an end. You can't take all of them, you know. Jade looked up to find Doc Freeman standing in the doorway, his medical bag slung over one shoulder. The base medic had a gentle smile on his face and understanding in his eyes. I know, she replied. Admiral's orders, 1 dog only. Have you decided which one? Jade's gaze swept across the assembled Malinois. Rex, who had saved her life, and would probably try to do so again given half a chance. Shadow, whose obedience was matched only by her intelligence. Ghost, the fastest dog she had ever worked with. Titan, whose strength had turned the tide of more than one operation. And Luna, the smallest of the pack. The only female. The one who had been dismissed by handlers who couldn't see past her size to the heart that burned inside her. "Yes," Jade said quietly. "I have." Freeman nodded, unsurprised. "Luna's a good choice. She has something the others don't." "What's that?" "The need to prove herself. Rex is already a legend. Shadow and Ghost and Titan have nothing left to accomplish. But Luna—" He paused. "Luna is still hungry, still searching for her place. That kind of drive can be more valuable than any amount of training." Jade rose from her seat, crossing to Luna's enclosure. The small Malinois was watching her with bright, alert eyes, tail wagging with barely contained anticipation. "You're coming with me, girl. Ready for an adventure?" Luna barked once, sharp and eager. "That's what I thought." She opened the enclosure and let Luna out, watching as the small dog immediately began investigating her surroundings with the intensity of a detective at a crime scene. Rex raised his head, watching his packmate with an expression that seemed almost paternal. "Take care of her," Jade told him, kneeling to scratch behind his ears. "You're the alpha now, old friend. Keep them safe. Keep them together. And when I come back—" She didn't finish the sentence. Couldn't finish it. The uncertainty of her mission, the dangers that waited in Texas, the possibility that she might not come back at all. These things hung unspoken in the air between them. Rex pressed his head against her palm, his eyes conveying a promise that transcended words. "I'll be here. I'll always be here." "I know you will," she whispered. "I know." The departure ceremony was small and informal. Colonel Hayes had offered something more elaborate, but Jade had declined, preferring to leave without fanfare. Only a handful of personnel gathered at the main gate as the sun crept toward the horizon. Hayes himself, Silas Porter, Ethan Graves, Noah Bennett, and a few others who had earned the right to say goodbye. Amber Sutton was there too, standing slightly apart from the group, her expression uncertain. When Jade approached her, the younger woman flinched. "I wanted to apologize one more time," Amber said quickly, the words tumbling out like she'd been rehearsing them. "For everything. The things I said, the way I acted. There's no excuse." "You're right," Jade agreed. "There isn't." Amber's face fell. "But," Jade continued, "there is explanation. You saw what you expected to see. A civilian who didn't belong. You treated me the way you'd learned to treat people who seemed weaker than you. That's not a character flaw. That's conditioning. It still doesn't make it right." "No, but it makes it fixable." Jade put a hand on Amber's shoulder. "You're a good handler, petty officer. I watched you work with Ghost during today's session. You have instincts that can't be taught. The question is whether you'll let those instincts guide you, or whether you'll keep hiding behind the kind of behavior you saw others model." Amber's eyes were wet. "I'll do better, Master Chief. I promise." "Don't promise me. Promise yourself." Jade squeezed her shoulder once, then released it. "And promise the dogs. They're the ones who matter." She moved through the small crowd, exchanging words with each person in turn. Hayes offered a formal salute, which she returned with equal precision. Porter shook her hand with the grip of a man who had found something he'd stopped believing existed. Bennett looked like he wanted to say a dozen things but couldn't find the right words, settling instead for a nod that conveyed more than speeches ever could. Graves was last. "The extraction team will meet you at the rendezvous point in 72 hours, he said, his voice pitched low for privacy. "If you miss the window, we'll assume you've been compromised and initiate contingency protocols." "Understood." "Jade." He used her first name deliberately, stepping outside the boundaries of professional courtesy. "Be careful. These people we're dealing with, they're not amateurs. If they figure out who you are, they won't. But if they do—" She met his eyes steadily. Then Luna and I will handle it the way we handle everything. Together. Graves didn't look reassured, but he nodded. Good luck, Phantom. Luck is for people who don't prepare. She smiled, taking the edge off the words. But I'll take it anyway. The SUV was waiting, its engine running, Luna already secured in the back. Jade climbed into the passenger seat and closed the door, watching through the window as Fort Sentinel began to recede into the distance. The last thing she saw before the base disappeared from view was a line of dogs sitting along the fence line, their silhouettes dark against the fading sunset. 14 of them, sitting perfectly still, watching her go. And she knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic or reason, that they would be waiting when she returned. However long that took, whatever happened in between. The road to Texas stretched out before her, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the desert like a scar. Luna had moved from the back seat to the front, curling up on the passenger seat with her head resting on Jade's thigh. The small Malinois had accepted the change in circumstances with the adaptability that made her so valuable. No anxiety, no confusion, just quiet readiness for whatever came next. Jade drove through the night, stopping only for fuel and brief walks that gave Luna a chance to stretch her legs. The landscape shifted as the hours passed, from Arizona's rocky deserts to the rolling plains of New Mexico to the harsh beauty of West Texas. By the time dawn broke on the second day, she was less than 50 miles from Presidio and the facility that would be her home for the foreseeable future. She pulled off at a rest stop to review the briefing materials one final time. The cover identity was solid. Rachel Torres, civilian dog trainer from California, experienced with protection dogs and looking for work in the private security sector. Her credentials would check out. Her references would confirm her story. Her skills would speak for themselves. The only variable was what she would find when she got there. Ready, Luna? The dog lifted her head, ears perked forward. Yeah, me too. She pulled back onto the highway, the sun rising at her back, illuminating the road ahead with the promise of a new day and the dangers that waited within it. 3 weeks later, the phone rang at Fort Sentinel. Colonel Hayes answered it on the second ring, his expression shifting as he listened to the voice on the other end. When he hung up, he sat in silence for a long moment, processing what he'd just heard. Then he reached for his secure line and dialed a number he knew by heart. Silas, it's Hayes. I just got word from NCIS. Porter's voice came through tight with concern. And? She found them, the network, the facility, everything. Hayes paused. She's coming home. 400 miles to the south, Jade Holloway stepped out of a federal detention facility where 16 men who had thought themselves untouchable were now facing charges that would keep them locked away for decades. Luna trotted at her heels, the small Malinois showing no signs of fatigue, despite 3 weeks of operations that had pushed both of them to their limits. The Texas sun beat down on her shoulders as she walked toward the parking lot, where a familiar SUV was waiting. Graves stood beside it, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes betraying relief. Thought you might miss your extraction window, he said as she approached. Never. She opened the rear door for Luna, who jumped in without hesitation. How are things at Fort Sentinel? Stable. Thornton's unit completed their K-9 qualification last week. All 15 dogs passed with flying colors. Graves smiled slightly. Porter says it's like watching different people. Same handlers, same dogs, completely different results. Good. Jade climbed into the passenger seat. That's good. They drove in companionable silence for several miles before Graves spoke again. The Admiral wants to debrief you personally, says he has another assignment, if you're interested. I'm always interested. It's not K-9 related, different kind of operation entirely. He wouldn't give details over unsecured channels. Graves glanced at her. You could say no. Take some leave. Go somewhere that doesn't involve cartels or smuggling networks, or going undercover in facilities run by people who would kill you without hesitation. Jade considered this. The weight of the past month pressed against her bones, exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. She thought about beaches and mountains and quiet places where the only sounds were waves or wind. She thought about what it might feel like to be just a person for a while instead of an operative. Then she thought about the men and women who were counting on people like her to keep them safe. The ones who would never know her name but would benefit from her work. The chain of service that stretched back through generations of quiet professionals who did hard things so others wouldn't have to. "I'll listen to what he has to say," she said finally. "But first, I want to go back to Fort Sentinel." Graves raised an eyebrow. "That's not exactly on the way to Washington." "No, but there's something I need to do there, someone I need to see." He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. The SUV turned north, heading for Arizona and the base where 14 dogs were waiting for their alpha to come home. The return to Fort Sentinel happened without ceremony or announcement. Jade had specifically requested it that way, preferring to arrive unnoticed rather than face another round of attention and formality. The base had seen enough spectacle during her last visit, but dogs have their own ways of knowing things. She was still 300 feet from the kennel when the howling started. It began with Rex, his distinctive voice rising into the evening air like a signal flare. Shadow joined in within seconds, then Ghost, then Titan, then the others. 14 voices raised in chorus, a sound that carried across the compound and brought personnel running from every direction. By the time Jade reached the kennel fence, a crowd had gathered. Blake Thornton was there, his uniform crisp, his bearing transformed. Amber Sutton stood beside him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Silas Porter was grinning like a man who had just won a bet no one remembered making. But Jade saw none of them. She saw only the dogs. They pressed against the fence, tails wagging, bodies wriggling with joy that couldn't be contained. Rex had his paws up on the chain link, his tongue lolling, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that spoke of weeks of waiting and hoping and believing. "Open the gate," Jade said quietly. Someone complied. She never saw who. The moment the barrier was removed, 14 dogs exploded toward her like a furry tidal wave. She went down under the onslaught, laughing as tongues and paws and wet noses competed for her attention. Rex claimed prime position, his head pressed against her chest, his whole body shaking with the force of his happiness. Luna had joined the pile, the smallest dog wriggling her way to the center where she could be close to her person and her pack at the same time. For several minutes, Jade simply lay there, surrounded by fur and love and the simple, uncomplicated joy of reunion. The crowd watched in silence, witnessing something that went beyond training or discipline or military protocol. This was family. This was home. This was what all the missions and sacrifices and long nights were really about. Eventually, Jade managed to extract herself from the canine celebration. Her clothes were covered in hair and slobber, and she suspected her face had been licked more times in the past 5 minutes than in the previous 5 years combined. She didn't care. "Master Chief," Blake Thornton stepped forward, his voice carrying new respect. "Welcome back." "Thank you, Lieutenant Commander." She brushed herself off, achieving approximately nothing. "I hear congratulations are in order. Your unit passed qualification?" "All 15 dogs. All handlers certified." Pride flickered across his face, mixed with something deeper. "We couldn't have done it without the foundation you laid, what you taught us. It changed everything." "It changed you," Jade corrected. "The teaching just pointed you in the right direction. The hard work was yours." She looked around the assembled group, seeing faces that had transformed since her departure. The hostility was gone, replaced by something that looked a lot like understanding. The arrogance had softened into confidence. The judgment had mellowed into acceptance. These were not the same people who had tormented a supply clerk. These were people who had learned. "I'm not staying long," she announced, addressing the group. "I have a debrief in Washington, and probably another assignment after that. But I wanted to see you, all of you, to see what you'd become." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the faces before her. "I'm proud of you. Every single one of you. Not for passing qualification, though that matters. I'm proud of you for having the courage to change, for looking at the way you behaved and choosing to be different. That's harder than any training exercise, and you did it." Amber Sutton finally lost her battle with tears. She stepped forward, wrapping her arms around Jade in a hug that was half apology and half gratitude. Jade hesitated for only a moment before returning the embrace. "Thank you," Amber whispered, "for not giving up on us." "I don't give up on people," Jade replied. "I just wait for them to catch up." The evening that followed was informal and warm. Someone produced food from the mess hall. Someone else found chairs and set them up near the kennels. Stories were shared, lessons were exchanged, and bonds were strengthened between people who had started as adversaries and ended as something closer to allies. Through it all, the dogs remained close to Jade, as if afraid she might disappear again if they let her out of their sight. Rex claimed permanent position at her left side, while Luna settled on her right. The others arranged themselves in a loose circle, their presence a constant reminder of the connections that had survived distance and time and all the complications of the human world. As the night deepened and the crowd began to thin, Jade found herself alone with the dogs and the stars. "I have to go soon," she told them, knowing they couldn't understand her words, but hoping they could feel her meaning. "There are more missions, more bad people who need to be stopped, more work that only ghosts can do." Rex pressed his head against her hand. "But I'll come back. I always come back. And when I do—" She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The dogs knew. They always knew. The departure came at dawn, just as it had before. Jade stood at the main gate with Luna at her side, watching the sun paint the eastern sky in shades of gold and rose. The SUV waited behind her. Graves was at the wheel, patient as ever. She turned back for one final look at Fort Sentinel. The 14 remaining dogs sat in a perfect line along the fence, exactly as they had the last time she left. Their eyes tracked her movement, their bodies still, their attention unwavering. Rex was at the center, his position as alpha clear and uncontested. He raised his head slightly as she watched, acknowledging her presence, promising her return. "Until next time," she whispered. Then she climbed into the SUV and drove away, leaving Fort Sentinel behind, but carrying its memory forward into whatever challenges waited ahead. In the fading rearview mirror, 14 silhouettes remained motionless against the rising sun. Waiting. Always waiting. Because that's what family does. What an incredible journey. If this story moved you, smash that like button and share it with fellow veterans and military supporters. Subscribe if you haven't already, and comment below. What was your favorite moment? Was it when the dogs surrounded her, or when the Admiral called? Check out our next video on screen for another powerful military story. Thank you for watching. The Texas highway stretched endlessly before them, shimmering with heat mirages that made the distance seem to dance. Luna had settled into her customary position on the passenger seat, her head resting on Jade's thigh, her breathing slow and steady. "There's something I didn't tell you," Graves said, breaking a long silence. "About the Admiral's new assignment." Jade glanced at him. "What is it?" "It involves dogs. Not just any dogs." He kept his eyes on the road. "Military working dogs that have gone missing. 17 of them over the past 6 months. Different bases, different programs. No apparent connection. Until now." "What changed?" "We found a pattern. All 17 dogs were scheduled for retirement. All 17 were supposed to be adopted by their handlers or placed with veteran families." Graves's jaw tightened. "Instead, they disappeared. Paperwork says they were euthanized due to behavioral issues, but the paperwork is wrong." Jade processed this information, her mind already beginning to map possibilities and implications. Someone stealing retired military dogs. Why? That's what the Admiral wants you to find out. Graves finally looked at her, his expression grim. "But Jade, there's something else. Something that makes this personal. What? 3 of those 17 dogs came from Fort Sentinel, from a program that existed before you arrived, a program that trained canine units for operations that are still classified. Jade's blood went cold. Which dogs? Graves reached into the back seat, retrieving a folder that he handed to her. Inside were photographs and service records for 3 Belgian Malinois, their military histories spanning years of operations and commendations. She recognized one of them immediately. Atlas, she breathed. I trained Atlas. He was one of the best dogs I ever worked with before Operation Shadow Border. He was supposed to be retired to a veteran family in Montana. According to official records, he was euthanized 8 months ago. Behavioral issues. That's impossible. Atlas was the gentlest dog in the program outside of work. He used to let children climb all over him. There's no way he had behavioral issues. I know. Graves's voice was soft. That's why we need you. Jade stared at the photograph for a long moment. Atlas's familiar face looked back at her, frozen in time, his eyes carrying the intelligence and loyalty she remembered so well. 17 dogs, stolen from the programs that had trained them, from the country they had served, from the handlers who had trusted them. Someone was going to pay for that. When do I start? She asked. As soon as you're ready. Jade looked down at Luna, who had lifted her head at the change in her voice. The small Malinois met her gaze with unwavering trust. I'm ready now. They drove on through the Texas heat toward Washington and briefings and a new mission that would take her deeper into the shadows than she had ever gone before. Behind her, 400 miles to the northwest, 14 dogs still sat along the fence at Fort Sentinel, watching the road she had traveled, waiting for the day she would return. They would be waiting a long time. But that was all right. Dogs understand patience better than humans ever could. They understand loyalty that doesn't waver, love that doesn't fade, faith that doesn't break. And they understand in their own way that some people are worth waiting for, no matter how long it takes, no matter what happens in between. They say dogs don't have long-term memory. They say animals don't understand concepts like loyalty or sacrifice or hope. But on that night, and every night that followed, 14 military working dogs sat vigil at the fence of Fort Sentinel, their eyes fixed on the darkening road, their bodies still as statues. Waiting, believing, knowing, in that way that only dogs can know, that their alpha would return. And until she did, they would guard the border they had sworn to protect. Together. Always together, because that's what family does.